Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The sky over the continent of Arendar was as tense as the air between its races. A streak of red orange clouds cut across the horizon like fresh wounds, an omen to many, though the man standing on the balcony of the presidential palace refused to see it that way. President Leo, tall and steady despite the burden on his shoulders, watched the sun's final descent. His mind, however, was far from the beauty of the sunset. The delicate peace between humans, elves, and dwarves fragile as glass was about to shatter, and it would be his people caught in the crossfire. In the distance, the towers of the elven capital of Loria shimmered, reflecting the waning light. Beyond that, the jagged peaks of the dwarven mountains loomed, shadowed and foreboding. Arendar, a land once full of promise, was now a ticking clock, counting down the moments until war consumed it. "Sir, it's time," a voice came from behind him. Leo turned to see General Cormac, his chief military advisor. The general's face was as hard as the armor he wore, but Leo could see the weariness in his eyes. The strain of maintaining order in a world teetering on the edge of collapse was taking its toll on everyone. Leo nodded, his jaw tight as he stepped back into the room. The Grand Council chamber was filled with humanity's most influential figures. Ministers, generals, and diplomats stood in clusters, their hushed conversations punctuated by the occasional glance in Leo's direction. Each one held the same unspoken question: how much longer could they hold this uneasy peace? Leo took his place at the head of the long table, his presence enough to silence the room. "We have little time," he began, his voice steady but grave. "The summit is in 2 days. If we fail to secure peace, it will mean war. A war we are not prepared to win." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The humans had made strides in technology and strategy, but against the combined might of the dwarves' raw strength and the elves' ancient magic, their chances were slim. They were still seen by many as the lesser race, a subordinate power trying to claim a seat at the table of giants. "We've received reports that a dwarven outpost was attacked last night," Cormac added, his voice like gravel. "They're blaming us," a murmur rippled through the council. Leo's heart sank. Another incident, another spark to ignite the tinderbox. The tension between humans and dwarves had been building for years, fueled by border skirmishes and territorial disputes. This latest attack could be the tipping point. "I swear we had nothing to do with it," Leo said, though he knew that didn't matter. "It's clear that someone is trying to push us into war. Our priority must be to prevent that at all costs." He scanned the faces around the table. Some, like Cormac, were hardened by years of service, pragmatic and focused on survival. Others, like Minister Gallia, the youngest and most idealistic of the group, still held hope that peace could be achieved. But hope was a fragile thing in these times. "The elves and dwarves won't back down easily," Gallia said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "But if we can show them that we're serious about peace." "They won't listen to words anymore," interrupted Ambassador Wren, a seasoned diplomat who had spent years negotiating with the other races. "They've heard enough speeches. They want action." Leo knew Wren was right. The summit in 2 days was humanity's last chance to avert disaster, and he would need more than diplomacy to make it happen. "Then we give them action," Leo said, his voice firmer now, his decision made. "We go to the summit, and we offer them a sacrifice they can't ignore." The room fell silent, puzzled expressions on every face. "What kind of sacrifice?" Cormac asked, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Leo met his gaze, unflinching. "The only kind that will prove our commitment to peace. If it comes to it, I will give my life." Shock rippled through the room. Gasps and protests erupted from every corner. Cormac stood, fists clenched. "Sir, that's madness. Your life is too valuable. We need you to lead us. If I don't, there will be no one left to lead." Leo countered. The elves and dwarves need to see that we are willing to do whatever it takes to end this conflict. My death could save thousands of lives. Cormac slammed his hand on the table. There has to be another way. There isn't. Leo's voice was calm but resolute. We've tried negotiations, treaties, diplomacy, and they've all failed. If a human president willingly gives his life for peace, it will shock them into thinking twice about what they're about to do. Minister Gallia's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly. But there must be something else we can offer. Something less permanent. Leo gave her a sad smile. There isn't. And this isn't just about us anymore. It's about the future of all races. Someone has to break the cycle of hatred and mistrust. Someone has to be the first to act. His eyes moved across the room, meeting each gaze in turn. If my death can stop this war before it begins, then it's a price I'm willing to pay. The summit was held in the ancient Hall of the Three, a massive structure carved into the side of Mount Ishtar, a neutral territory revered by all races. The hall had seen centuries of negotiations, treaties, and betrayals, its stone walls bearing witness to the rise and fall of countless leaders. President Leo arrived with a small delegation, including General Cormac and Ambassador Wren. As they approached the hall, they were greeted by the imposing figures of dwarven guards, their armored forms barely concealing the hostility in their eyes. Beyond them, the elegant and ethereal figures of the elven delegation stood in stark contrast, their beauty cold and distant. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Elven High Priestess Allure stood at the head of her delegation, her silver hair flowing like moonlight over her shoulders. To her right, King Boruk of the Dwarves, his beard braided with silver and gold, glowered at the humans as if daring them to make a mistake. Leo stepped forward, every movement calculated and deliberate. He had one chance to sway them, and he knew it would take more than words. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm. He had made his decision. "Thank you for coming," Leo began, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "We are here today not as enemies, but as leaders of our people, and we stand on the brink of war." Alure's eyes narrowed, her voice soft but cutting. "War that was brought upon us by your kind, President Leo. Your people's expansion has encroached on our lands, and now dwarven blood has been spilled." Bork nodded, his fists clenched. "We demand justice for the attack on our outpost." Leo raised a hand, acknowledging their anger. "I understand your pain, King Boruk, and I do not deny that my people have made mistakes. But I also know that war will only bring more suffering, more lives lost, more families torn apart." The tension in the room was palpable, but Leo pressed on. "We all want peace. But peace requires more than just words. It requires sacrifice." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Today, I offer that sacrifice. Not in gold or land, but in blood." A murmur spread through the hall. Alure's eyes widened, and even Bork seemed taken aback. "What are you saying?" Allure asked, her voice barely a whisper. Leo took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I offer my life in exchange for peace between our people." For a moment, the hall was silent. Then Bork's booming voice shattered the stillness. "You would sacrifice yourself, a human president, for peace?" "Yes," Leo replied simply. "My death will be a symbol of our commitment to ending this cycle of violence." As the reality of Leo's words settled in, the weight of his sacrifice began to take hold. The leaders of the elves and dwarves exchanged uneasy glances. Alure's cold exterior cracked, revealing a glimmer of uncertainty. Boruk, who had always seen humans as opportunistic and weak, seemed genuinely shaken. This is unprecedented," Allure said, her voice softer now, less certain. "Why would you do this?" "Because it's the only way," Leo said. "We can keep fighting, and we'll all lose something precious, or we can choose a different path, one where we put aside our grudges and work together." Bork grunted, his brow furrowed. And what guarantee do we have that your people will honor this agreement after you're gone? Leo's expression hardened. You'll have my life as proof. My death will send a message to every human. Peace is worth more than any war. He stepped forward, pulling a ceremonial dagger from his belt, the blade that symbolized his authority as president. He held it up, the metal catching the light in the dim hall. Let this be the last blood spilled between our people. Leo's words lingered in the hall, echoing off the stone walls like a final plea for mercy from a dying man. The silence that followed was heavy, as though the entire world held its breath. The ceremonial dagger in Leo's hand gleamed under the faint light filtering through the high windows, catching the eyes of everyone present. It was a blade meant for kings, for oaths sworn and vows broken, never intended to take the life of the man who held it. Allure, the elven high priestess, stared at the dagger, her once steely gaze softened into something resembling shock. She had always thought of humans as ambitious, driven by self-interest. But here was their leader, offering the most precious thing he possessed, his life for the sake of peace. She took a step forward, her robes barely brushing the floor, her silver hair falling across her face. You would truly do this? Sacrifice yourself for a chance at peace? Leo's eyes met hers, unwavering. If my death prevents the deaths of thousands, then it's not a sacrifice, it's a duty. King Boruk of the dwarves stood motionless, his broad chest rising and falling as he wrestled with his thoughts. Dwarves respected strength, and yet, in this moment, it was not the strength of arms that impressed him, but the strength of will. He had never seen such a thing in a human. We dwarves believe in honor, Boruk grumbled, his voice deep and gruff. But this goes beyond what even we can fathom. If you die, what of your people? Will they follow your path of peace, or will your death incite them to revenge? Leo's grip tightened on the dagger, the weight of Boruk's words pressing into him like an unrelenting burden. I have faith in my people. They've seen enough bloodshed. They don't want revenge, they want a future. My death will remind them of the cost of hatred. Boruk's eyes narrowed, as though he was searching for some flaw in Leo's resolve, something that would prove him false. But there was nothing. Leo stood firm, unwavering, and Boruk could see the truth in his eyes. The Dwarven King's massive shoulders sagged slightly as the fight drained out of him. Your courage, human. It will not be forgotten. Leo nodded, his gaze shifting to Allure. The High Priestess still looked uncertain, torn between her long-held prejudices and the reality of the moment. Leo stepped closer to her, close enough that he could see the faint lines of age etched into her otherwise flawless skin. You've lived through more than I can imagine, he said softly. You've seen the cycles of history. War, peace, war again. But this can be different. We can break the cycle. Allure's lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, she merely nodded, a small but significant gesture. Leo knew that was the closest thing to agreement he would get from her. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle fully onto his shoulders. There was no turning back now. Slowly, deliberately, Leo raised the ceremonial dagger, positioning it over his heart. The sharp edge pressed against his chest, cold and unyielding. He closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself for what was to come. His heart pounded in his ears, but his mind was clear. He thought of his people, of their future, of the lives that would be spared, the wars that would never happen. It was enough. Without hesitation, he thrust the dagger into his chest. The sharp pain was immediate, radiating out from the point of impact, but Leo didn't falter. His breath hitched as the blade drove deeper, blood welling up around it and soaking into his clothes. He could hear gasps from those around him, but the sound seemed distant, muffled. His vision swam, but he forced himself to stay upright, gripping the handle of the dagger as though it was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Leo staggered slightly, but didn't fall. He raised his head, locking eyes with Allure one last time. Peace is worth it, he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. And then, slowly, as though in slow motion, He collapsed to the ground. The dagger slipped from his grip, clattering against the stone floor. His blood pooled beneath him, a dark stain spreading across the cold stone. The hall was deathly silent, the only sound the faint echo of the dagger's fall. For a long moment, no one moved. The leaders of the elves, dwarves, and humans stood frozen, as though the world itself had stopped turning. The weight of what had just happened and what Leo had just done pressed down on them all, like the heaviest of burdens. Finally, it was Allure who broke the silence. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and knelt beside Leo's still form. Her delicate fingers brushed against his bloodied chest, her face an unreadable mask. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He has paid the ultimate price." Bork stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over both Leo and Allura. He looked down at the human president, his expression one of reluctant respect. "He did what no other leader could do," Bork said gruffly. "He put the future of his people above himself." Allura stood, her silver robes stained with Leo's blood, and faced the assembled leaders. "Let it be known that this man died for peace," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying the weight of her centuries of wisdom. "And in honor of his sacrifice, I will sign the treaty." Bork nodded, his own voice low but resolute. As will I. The bloodshed ends here." The human delegation, stunned into silence by the events that had just unfolded, finally found their voices. Ambassador Wren stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "We will uphold President Leo's legacy. Peace will prevail." The treaty was signed in the Hall of the Three, witnessed by the leaders of all three races. It was a solemn affair, devoid of the usual pomp and ceremony. The ink was still wet on the parchment when Leo's body was carried away, his sacrifice already becoming the stuff of legend. In the days that followed, word of Leo's death spread across the continent. Humans, dwarves, and elves alike spoke of the man who had given his life for peace, his name whispered in reverence by those who had once scoffed at the idea of human leadership. The tensions between the races did not disappear overnight, but Leo's sacrifice had changed something fundamental. For the first time in centuries, there was a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, peace could last. Leo's funeral was held in the capital city, attended by thousands. His body, draped in the flag of his people, was laid to rest in a tomb carved from the same stone that had witnessed his final act. A statue was erected in his honor, depicting him not as a warrior, but as a man of peace, the ceremonial dagger held aloft in one hand, a symbol of his sacrifice. As the years passed, Leo's name became synonymous with peace. His death had forged a new path for humanity, one where they were no longer seen as a lesser race, but as leaders respected by elves and dwarves alike. The peace treaty he had brokered held strong, though it was not without its challenges. There were still those who sought to reignite old grudges, but Leo's legacy was a powerful deterrent. His memory lived on in the hearts of those who believed in the future he had fought for. And so, the wheel of destiny turned. The cycle of war and peace continued, but this time, there was hope. Hope that the sacrifices of one man could break the chains of the past and forge a new future for all races. President Leo had given everything, but in doing so, he had ensured that his people and all the peoples of Arendora would have a chance at a future free from the shadows of war.